Climate Change Response Removal of Transitional Measure Amendment Bill is set down for committee stage forthwith. I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Climate Change Response Removal of Transitional Measures Bill. Amendment Bill. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The House and Committee on the Climate Change Response Removal of Transitional Measure Amendment Bill. Jami-Lee Ross.
Mr. Chair, I seek leave for all questions in this debate to be taken as one debate and voted on separately.
Is there any objection to that process? There appears to be none. It shall be the case. Therefore, the question is that parts 1 and 2, the schedule, clause 1 to 3, stand part.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And as is the custom when we are in urgency, the committee stage is an important part of the legislative process to ask some of the questions that may have otherwise been asked in the select committee process. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to put on the record that while Labor is supporting this legislation, we are committed to cross-party approaches to climate change to produce enduring political solutions. I think all of us in this House understand that our response to climate change is going to outlast any government. These are plans that we have to put in place that will take decades, and I do think it would be preferable that we could do this kind of legislation in a way other than under urgency, without the proper way for us to have good cross-party discussions about what good plans and good legislation would look like, Mr. Chairman, and that is something that we do hold dearly, and to put in play our commitment to those enduring cross-party solutions. Some of the questions that I have for the Minister and the Chair, and I'd appreciate some answers to, around the $25 cap that has been signalled with this legislation, that the $25 price ceiling that was in the principal legislation is going to remain under this legislation. And I'd ask the Minister if there is a time frame around that cap, if there is a time frame around lifting that cap, and whether or not the time frame around lifting the cap, whether you have in play a plan for that to rise, because we know that industry and business are planning for a far greater and higher price of carbon than that. We know that Business New Zealand's energy report that came out showed that they were modelling on a $60 to $115 by 2050 price of carbon per tonne. So this certainly isn't what industry is banking on, a $25 cap. So I would be interested from the Minister to hear the kind of time frame that she has around that. I'd also be interested to hear from the Minister whether or not there was any consideration of a price floor to be put in place to sit alongside the price ceiling. Because, Mr. Speaker, if we want to avoid, Mr. Chairman, sorry, if we want to avoid a situation such as we got into with the hot air credits, with the dodgy credits that made our way into our emissions trading scheme, in an earlier part of our history that could have been avoided, a further protection we could put in place is by enacting a price floor. And I would like to know whether the Minister received any advice on that and whether that was a consideration that she took on board. I'd also like now to turn my attention to clause 7 of this legislation, which is repealing the temporary suspension of allocation entitlement for eligible agricultural activities, and ask this Minister, what is the timeline for the anomalies that exist within the ETS? 49% of the emissions in New Zealand come from agriculture, and yet clause 7 is entrenching the idea that we have eligible and ineligible agricultural activities. If New Zealand wants to address its greenhouse gases, then we have to address nitrous oxide and we have to address methane. There is very, very sophisticated work going on around the world about how it is that we might account for different gases. Under the Kyoto Protocol, it was one gas, one price. But we know that there is significant scientific work happening around the world about how it is that the short run and the long run gases behave and how we may account for those differently. So I would like to know the advice and the thinking from the Minister around what it is about when we are finally going to grasp the nettle of agriculture in our ETS. Because this legislation entrenches the giant subsidy that industry is handing out to agriculture, that we are continuing to subsidise agriculture through our other productive industrial sectors in New Zealand, and that is not something that can continue if New Zealand is ever going to meet its emission reduction targets. To claim that we have a unique profile is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, Mr Chairman. Our unique profile means that we must act quickly, and waiting for the silver bullet of science and technology to develop some way that when you put carbohydrate through a ruminant, it isn't going to somehow produce methane or nitrous oxide is sheer folly. That the science isn't going to solve this, that we have to simply put in place some other measures, and Clause 7 is a further entrenchment of that, Mr Speaker. So there's some of my initial questions for the Minister and the Chair, Mr Chairman.